All right, I think we should be live again. Yeah, we're live again.
Cool.
Or at least I think we are. Yeah, there we go. Yep. But yeah, so yeah, building from your players out is 100% the move. That's the move. You absolutely want to be doing that. You also want to be not building too far out from where your players are at, or building too much out from where your players, or building too much that couldn't possibly impact your players. And again, this is all about those people that put in a lot of work to the world building, and then are stressed out by it, feel like it's a laborious, like it's an irritating task, and feel like it's eating up too much of their time. Because that's the thing. If you're doing it because you feel like you need to do it rather than just want to do it, then you're eating time. But Brandon, what if you want to do it? What if it's what you like to do?
I really enjoy world building. I really like writing about the histories of characters and regions and the connections and the weird things that go on in places and what makes those places unique. And I think there is a way to to go ahead and strike that balance. One of the things to remember, especially when you're talking about a fantasy medieval society, and I don't know if I've lost you or not, Steve. Are you there?
No, you haven't lost me.
Okay. You're just out of focus and so still. You're practically Drax the Destroyer.
I do disappear very easily.
Is to make one, to be okay with the history of your world being loose. In a society completely made of people writing things down on paper and being communicated by word of mouth, you don't necessarily need to flesh out your history. If you want to, you can, but realize that that's work that may never, ever, ever see the light of day. And so if you're wanting to build stuff that sees the light of day, you should ask yourself a question whenever you're writing an idea down, is how will this be visible to my players? Mm-hmm. And that's still that kind of same mentality of building out from there, but building out from your players is more of like an improv concept of letting your players help craft your world for you. When you're coming up with an idea of like, oh, I'm going to write about what happened in this region 7,000 years ago, well, is that going to be something meaningful to your players? If it has to do with an ancient evil lord that's coming back from the dead to conquer the land, then yes, that is going to. It's probably not going to be all that important. And if you want to write that down, you shouldn't dedicate all that much time to
it. Yeah, exactly.
One of my favorite things to do when it comes to world building is focusing on that narrower focus, building out a town. I like building like as an exercise. One of the things you can ask yourself when you're building a town is like, what is this town's trade? What does this town do that makes a town existing possible?
It's definitely a fishing village.
Yes, the most exciting possible
fishing
trade.
Village. There's like a little dock. It's either a small town with like a few fishing boats, or a port town with many fishing boats and trade. But what does this town do? Is it a mining town? Is it a farmer's hub? Is it a sleazy kind of like collection of is it a casino world, if you will?
Yeah,
casino town.
Most cities are just going to be built on the fact that they're probably near a source of water that allows travel and trade. That's most cities. But think about that. That's fairly true of most cities in the United States and in the world at large.
Yeah, but bring it down further. Not city, town.
Yes.
You don't need to have whole districts. You don't need to reinvent Waterdeep as your opening sessions. That's wild.
But like one of my favorite ones, a world building idea I had, and this is on a larger scale too, and this is a very old idea I had a long time ago,
Mm-hmm.
was like a steampunk world built on top of a volcano, in which it was an island volcano, and they would pump water out of the oceans into a giant boiler in the caldera of the volcano to power just an enormous steam pressure machine that powered the whole city.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like a thing that set the tone for that city. Another example of doing something like this would be, if you like that kind of clockwork thing, would be to have a city posed in a river up in a mountain, and they're making, they're powering their village off of the water flow using tons of spinning wheels from their water.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you have, well, there's a region for that. Now, what are they using that power to get? Are they mining? Is there some sort of unique material that's only available there? If there is, then suddenly you have all sorts of things that can sprout from that.
Mm-hmm.
If it's like a town with a coveted resource, then suddenly you're like, well, how could that be interesting to my players? The town is threatened by a group of bandits who want to steal the resource.
Classic.
Suddenly, easy, straightforward thing.
I'm going to talk about a little-known television series called Jericho. Okay, so Jericho is a television series. This is relevant to your point. Okay. Jericho is a television series that went for 2 seasons.
Yeah.
In that 2-season run, the first season is about this town called Jericho, and like there had been an apocalyptic event. I can't remember what the event was. And they didn't really know a lot of information about it. It's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, kind of in the Midwest of America, Midwest South, right?
Middle of nowhere.
Middle of nowhere, farming town, right? And so the apocalypse has happened, and you jump in several months after this has happened when they're in they're not like figuring out what the apocalypse is. They will eventually, but they're mostly focused on survival. They no longer have an external U.S. power grid. They no longer have connections with a lot of the external things. So they're kind of returning to a more rural lifestyle, right? And everything, and then like strangers come through, and it's been long enough that they recognize that not all strangers are good, right? And so you as the viewer, and this is why this is important for GMs, because your players are in a way audience to your world and the stuff that you give them to play with and everything like that. You don't really know what's going on. The part of it is the mystery in the ensemble cast. You're learning about the conflicts, the ins and outs, uncovering information about what they were before and what they are now and how that applies. And then in the second season, they reveal enough of the mystery where now they're traveling to basically a new California Republic a la Fallout, and that area's thing. They're getting a bigger idea of the globe. And now they've lost a lot of what was satisfying about the plot, which is that they had plenty of room to do character work, challenges, and struggles in the town in season 1. And then they got so big and they started explaining all that stuff, and it got convoluted and watered down, and the things that you cared about as an audience weren't necessarily the focus of the story anymore. Now, I'm not saying that every campaign needs to live in the same space for the whole campaign. That's wild. But like what that means is that even with a season of television, they quickly went to too much stuff eventually before they acknowledged that every area, every new region or new faction needed time to kind of rest and understand and investigate in the way that they'd set up the story. And a lot of TTRPGs, especially big campaigns, are about uncovering the truth of things. They're about uncovering and understanding the way things work, and then figuring out how to solve them, and then resolving that bigger, much macro-ier problem. And so you don't have to rush to reveal all of that information, because your players are going to enjoy the challenges you give them while they don't have it, piece by piece.
The other thing about that kind of approach of keeping it on like a smaller town is that's actually also very reminiscent of how old school D&D was run. Old school D&D often had one town that you were in, or one city, and a nearby dungeon. and it was expected that during the course of your session, you would go into the dungeon, clear a path, and then by the end of the session, you would have to escape with your loot back to town.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you could populate your town with a cast of characters that are interacting with each other, and you can stay focused on that narrow treatment. Now, one of the things that I've been thinking about is like your pantheon. You have a pantheon of characters in our game.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking recently about like how do you create a pantheon in your world that is meaningful to your players, especially if you don't already have a character who is inherently religious in the group.
Yeah.
Right. And so think about how does that religion manifest in the world? And probably the most common example of this is holidays. Like, what holidays do people celebrate
Mm-hmm.
in your world? A great way to introduce your characters to a god in your setting is by saying, here is their holiday, and what do the people do on that holiday to show their worship for your god?
Yeah, what does the community come together to do?
And that once again puts it right down on that personal level. It's that way you don't have to go in and have your characters go into a church and have a priest sit down with a old dusty tome and start going over exposition about what these gods did and whatnot. Instead, you can start off with pulling the characters straight into the real lives of regular people and how they connect to the gods.
So, I don't know if I've ever revealed this directly to you. I probably have, because I'm pretty transparent about things that I sort of like invent in the moment. So one of the things in our campaign is that the character you're playing wants to become an avatar for a champion for the two trickster gods who are twins.
I almost think of them as the hidden gods now.
They kind of are in a way, and everything. And I always knew that I wanted to involve like a trickster god. That's what I knew. And then offhandedly, I had put these two little kids with like a lemonade stand. That was like a weird situation and encounter. And in that moment, I'm like, oh, these are the I didn't know that it was twins. I didn't know how I was going to introduce them. And I was like, what? Kids have lemonade stands. And this is kind of like a nice, like, well-populated, pretty, like, common and functioning town thing. So kids would have a lemonade stand. Let's put two little weird kids in front of the party. And then in that moment, in that thought, I was like, oh, these are the trickster gods. I did not plan for two little kids to be the trickster gods. I didn't have like this big plan where I'm going to introduce them and see if they figure it out. I was like, oh, wouldn't that be a fun way for gods to introduce themselves as two children, and especially trickster gods and everything. And I'm like, okay, apparently there's two trickster gods, which is what further cemented sort of the vibe I was going for with that pantheon of it being like tied very materially into the world, and into the theme that was more prevalent and prescient at the beginning of the game, which is sort of like a Western. And everything, and all of that kind of came about from that. And I believe I'd even really unpacked the sort of like other pantheon of gods a little bit more in a more classic like tabletop sense, where there was like knowledge that players would have or not care about or whatever about the worshipped gods of the area, which were not those two little trickster gods. They didn't know that those existed, because that was always going to be like, surprise, real gods.
Jokers.
Surprise. And then they became jokers, and then the poker deck pantheon kind of got exposed. And all of that sort of like was a eureka moment of me just being like, you know, it was weird. 2 little kids selling lemonade, and maybe there's something up with that lemonade. Maybe there's not. Maybe they're just weird little kids. I didn't know at the moment I first thought of it.
And now lemons and lemonade are like a revered holy beverage.
Yeah, and the laughter of like, and your character hears the giggling of 2 children, oftentimes, and
when I'm doing right,
and the druid,
kind of my compass,
who doesn't work. Who isn't like part of that pantheon and isn't trying to be, you know, like deeply connected to it, but was otherwise connected to it. It let me tie a bunch of things together, and it was just a moment. And so like, and it was just a lemonade stand. That's all it was. It was a fun moment for the characters, and then it became a big crux position of continuing and repeated interaction with the players. And you weren't even, at the time when those characters were interested, you weren't playing those NPCs.
No.
You weren't playing the NPC that makes sense for them. You were playing a different, or you weren't playing the character that made sense for them.
I was playing Barry back in the day.
Yeah, and so...
Man, how long has it been since I stopped playing Barry?
It's been a long time. It's got to have been a year. It's got to have been a year.
I think it's been more than half of the game now. Mm-hmm. I think I've been playing Chevy more than I played Barry.
But then you get into the next... yeah, but like all of this like kind of deeply informed the thing, and it was just a loose moment. And so that's why playing your characters playing your world building to your characters, keeping it small, keeping it contained, keeping it to something that is interesting for them to play with in the moment and informs them about the world without exposition, without constant lecturing, without handing out handouts about what they know about the world. Not that any of that stuff is terrible, but giving yourself the availability to not have to do that every time means that the role play is more exciting. Then when you do go into the I'm about to tell you some lore for 5 to 10 minutes, your players are more likely to pay attention to that part because they trust that it's like, all right, that's going to mean something, because that's not in the wild card play. That's not in the roulette wheel of chance. That's something that you very deliberately have introduced to us. So obviously this has a good chance of coming back to us. And then if you forget about it for several sessions and then remember it later, it seems like you've just done a good job at delaying the time when you return back to there.
DMs. By the way, Steve tells me about this stuff. My advice to you DMs out there: don't tell your players that you do this. Let them think that you're secretly a genius who's planned this shit all along.
Well, yeah, planned this shit all along. Or if you really want one of your players to become a GM, fully tell them that you're doing this. You're like, really make it apparent how much less work it is than it appears to do this. But more importantly, going back to building out, what I also like about going and starting in like a town and figuring out what that town's about, and then maybe having like a holiday or a festival there to kind of give the players an excuse to interact with the town and everything like that, and get a kind of a tone. You mentioned, of course, how do they celebrate the holiday? You can really set the tone of, it's like, everyone in the town has to give 15% of their resources or cattle in some sort of like burning sacrifice, right? That sets a very serious god tone.
Yeah,
to
that's
the
a very
situation.
You could use that festival or holiday to set whatever kind of tone you want, and it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a god too.
No, yeah.
It could be, because of how many holidays do we celebrate that have nothing to do with deities of any kind?
Yeah,
quite a few.
It can be, or you can use it as a misdirect, where it's like they celebrate the holiday one way, and then like later on, sessions and sessions later, they find out that holiday was actually based off of a much deeper and darker lore, and that's how far removed modern and ill-prepared modern society is for these beings to come back. Or you could do another kind of thing where they celebrate it and then the god shows the fuck up, right? Or the supernatural being, if you will, shows up, and you can really surprise your characters with, it's like, oh no, this is like real. This is real as shit. No.
Oh, another good one. Another great one would be like, oh, you have an ancient demon lord that got banished 1,000 years ago, and your village is celebrating the day the demon lord was banished, when suddenly a bunch of demon worshipping cultists show up in town trying to resurrect the demon lord.
It creates all these like very tight, limited conflicts that really begin to set the tone. And then after you've done that and you've had your players for multiple sessions and you know what they ask questions about and you know what NPCs they like and what NPCs they don't like and everything, then you can start building out that world to create challenges that matter.
I need to remind the group to ask about, who we haven't seen in ages.
Yeah.
Bad Dickie.
All of your connections to Bad Dickie are hard to come by, but yeah, you can get a hold of Bad Dickie if you want him. He's off. He's doing things. I've got him in a Bad Dickie is in mission doing this, and if you ask about him, that'll be what's going on. So further into that kind of world building, where you're world building from the characters out and everything like that, I had mentioned one of the things that I would go back and change, and that I recommend every DM do, because it is a great way to address a lot of players that want to play kind of fantastical kind of characters. Like really, really oddball, and when I say fantastical, I'm talking about, anthropomorphic and really like insectoid and like really outside of humans. Is one of the other things that's really good is to not really build out a ton of details in your world, is that you can make the population of the world the player character's population, and that way, as a DM, it gives you the ability to really give them a huge influence on. It's like, all right, in this party we have a human and a half elf, which of course means that we need an elf as well if there's half elves, right? And we might have a dwarf, so we probably need dwarves and everything. And then we have an ASMR. No, let's not do ASMR. We have a genasi, right? An elemental genasi and everything. And maybe they're a fire genasi, right? And so they have an elemental beat to them. And then we have a whatever the big a gif, a griff.
A griff, yeah.
Yeah, the hippo people,
GIF.
right?
They're just called GIF.
GIF.
Which is very too close to GIF, which makes you think of the GIF Yanni.
Yeah, but and so we have hippo people. It's like, okay, so I have these things. There's humans, there's half-elves, there's elves, and there's dwarves. That's all very Tolkien, that's all very Lord of the Rings, that's all very Tread material and stuff like that. So that's pretty easy. Now, I have an elemental being, which means I need to make sure that I understand what level of presence do elemental beings have, and is fire the like one of the four elements, like the lore would imply in D&D, or is it in fact the only element left, or was it always the only element? Like there's just a group of people that grew in the under volcanoes of the earth, and they're called fire genasi, but they're affectionately just people that evolved to have willpower over that. And there's not like water or wind or earth. It's not Avatar. It's just that's just it. And there's a whole society about that and everything, and regions that they're more populated and less populated in. And then for the hippo people, it'd be like, all right, well, in bodies of water that are non-oceanic, this is a group of people that, kind of evolved in those bigger deep lakes. Where are the deep lakes? Are we on a city that's by a deep lake, sort of like the Great Lakes of North America, right? And everything. And is that the source of these people? Or are they kind of populated all over the world? Do they have different communities? And though I don't need everyone to hit all of those communities, could I argue or like randomly, accidentally say that there's a GIF that doesn't like your GIF in your party, and then later realize I'm like, oh, because they could just be from a different region. And we don't even have to go to that region, but now I've added that layer to that. And then I don't have to manage 20 fucking different sentient species and how they all work together. I don't have to create a history of the world that's millions of years old.
You don't have to include. You right there with that group. You don't have to include gnomes. For one, you can leave gnomes as like an aspect of the Fae.
Yeah, I can just be like, there's Fae, and they're brownies and pixies and gnomes and all these different kinds of creatures from lore, but they're like Fae. And I can have different species, different sentient creatures that aren't with the party, but now it becomes a surprise to see them. Or maybe they're extinct now, or maybe there's one wizard in a tower that's the last Githyanki, right? Kind of thing. And that becomes exciting and unique and various instead of you're just another one of the thing. And you're also continuing to let your players build out your world without really actually doing any wasteful or any more world building than you would have to do, because you would have to explain how they all existed anyway, which means that there would have to be people that progenited them in some fashion or another, and therefore there has to be history in some fashion or another around that. But then you don't have to fill out the world with it's like, oh, and then you're in this city, and the city's a hodgepodge of people. That's how Through the Mill is. That's how our campaign is. But
now let's talk about, because a big part of the talking point of this whole world building thing has been like making sure that when you're world building for your characters. World build for them so that they can, so that their characters can meaningfully interact with what you're building.
Yeah.
Because if you don't make it meaningful to them, it's not going to get used. So let's kind of we've been focusing on a very small scale. We've been focusing at
towns,
villages
macro,
and stuff. But
introduction.
Now you've been kind of talking about like larger scale stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking about like regions and potentially kingdoms or other nations.
Mm-hmm.
And even that stuff, while you're building it to create verisimilitude, to create a world that feels lived in, if it doesn't come to the attention of your players in some meaningful way, it's not going to matter. It's not going to create that verisimilitude that you're looking for. So, how do you then make a nation a meaningful story beat in your game? And there's also countless ways of doing that too, because you could be like, well, your nation and the nation next door, obviously, are they allies? Were they a long time at war and now they're currently in a strenuous peace? A lot of this will then be like, okay, let's say you have a smaller, more personal goal in mind, but you want to make your world feel meaningful in that regard of that expansive and detailed lore of interconnected nations and communication. You can put that goal in another country.
Yeah.
And immediately the politics between those two countries are gonna manifest simply by travel.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look to our world to do this too, but you don't want to do it too much because that can be problematic.
Mm-hmm.
But like, yeah, if you look at like, okay, all of your characters are from this region, and they travel to another region. How do the people of that region then feel
about foreigners?
About the foreigners coming to their land? Or does that country even tolerate immigrants at all?
Yeah.
Suddenly you have to sneak through this country and incognito and not get caught. And that becomes a meaningful thing where you're like, oh crap, we don't want to get caught and thrown in jail.
This is, by the way, avoiding things that are problematic in our world and making still those plot beats be accessible is why I don't do homogenous nations, right? I don't.
Yeah, you should. That's always a good thing to just not do.
It's an easy way to avoid it. If every nation has at least several different, because again, in fantasy and sci-fi and all of these things, we oftentimes have multiple kind of sentient kinds of player species.
I think the
or races.
Only place that you've done this in that you didn't do this was what was the town with the mechanical people?
Gamel is the spot, yeah.
Gamma was the exception.
With the Warforged, yeah.
With the Warforged.
But that's
and that makes sense though because of they're a manufactured group of people and there's no biological beings there.
Yeah, and so
that kind of is able to transcend the issue a bit.
It was, and like that wasn't like a powerful warring nation. They themselves were not particularly aggressive. There wasn't anything that was implied to be applied to be even really a society or a culture, and everything. Even though it had like little touches of that, it was mostly just like oh, these were essentially computers built to do tasks. But they were very, very smart computers, and then their builders were no longer available for them, and so now they're just sort of on autopilot, and everything. Yeah. But when you build your nations, and if you want conflict between nations, and you, again, on a grand scale campaign, you tend to like this tends to come up. You go to the classics. What do people fight over? Resources, access, presence or appearance, and ideology. And the key with ideology is because you are probably not going to only have, a couple monotheistic religions as your main probably religious center, because if you do religion, you're almost always going to go polytheistic in that. And a lot of the, in fantasy that has that kind of thing, fantasy that has gods, a lot of times those gods are very real and very fucking present in the world, and everything. You can dodge a lot of the kind of more problematic sort of invented divides of our humanity in our real world, and instead focus on legitimate divides that happen. Like, all right, so this is the wealthy nation. They have access to better resources for better trades, or they have access to the ports, and the inland nation is like where farmers are.
I just saw myself in the stream. I'm like, I'm making a weird face in this.
You are making a weird face. Okay, we're back.
I need to not make such weird faces. I'm on camera.
But as long as you take care with your ideologic conflicts, and don't mirror anything too gross in our own real history, which is pretty easy to do because you can have very real consequences and very real divides between cultures. But as I was saying, like a classic is, you've got the wealthy nation, and then you've got the nation that feeds the wealthy nation. And the nation that feeds the wealthy nation is fine, but it's being mistreated in order to profit the wealthy nation. Classic nation-to-nation conflict. Doesn't matter what your characters look like. Doesn't matter who your characters are as people. They are from wealthy nation, and people in slightly less wealthy nation are irritated because wealthy nation keeps taking advantage of their resources.
Now let's talk about how that plays out at a small level for your party. Your party gets a contract to go protect a village from a bunch of bandits. That village is in that wealthy nation, and those bandits are a town from the poor nation that did not get properly protected and was destroyed.
Yep.
And then suddenly they're left without resources, and now you have a real moral quandary, which is actually good storytelling.
Yeah, instead of
these bandits who are just trying to make a living in a world where they've been completely displaced.
Yeah, the reason so many actual plays and D&D campaigns are like capitalism is the real villain, or imperialism, which is just a different kind of arm extension of capitalism, is the real villain, is because it is the real villain. It is the real villain. It always works. It's never bad. It works on a micro level. It works on a macro level. As long as, again, to a lot of plot conflicts that are more interesting than there's an evil dragon that's enslaving a town. Or there's a...
And even dragons are metaphors for capitalism.
They're just they're just billionaires. That's all that they are.
Just billionaires. Dragons are just billionaires.
But and so those kinds of things. Or you can go super classic and have genuinely okay, there's a bunch of demons and devils. and they are pouring up to the earth and causing problems.
Don't be afraid to make your conflict simple.
Yeah, that can be very fine, because that is as simple as, like, what do? Well, they're powered by souls, so they trick people / take people by force to get their souls and everything. And it's like, well, can we negotiate with them? They don't see you as people; they see you as cattle to be consumed. All right, well, then we need to deal with that problem. So that's a simple
It's okay
morality
to have fairy tale adventures.
Yeah.
That are clear-cut black and white, so long as you don't then mix those things with real-world problems.
Yeah, that's where you go to it. You come across a tower. The tower's got a man that kidnaps all the local town children. And then when they're seen a few days later, they don't remember anything about who they were or whatever, and it's because he's stealing their memories and presence in order to give himself immortality somehow, because it's fucking magic and you can make it do whatever it wants and everything. And it's like, well, that's bad. That's a bad person, and that bad person needs to be dealt with handily and readily and everything. That bad person doesn't have to deal with the religious pantheon. It doesn't have to necessarily be connected to your party and everything like that. It doesn't have to necessarily tie into your backstory. That's something that you invented. That's a very simple I solve problem, and you can pepper those in between all of the world building and stuff, because that builds the world right there. All right, well, apparently there's not like an organization of order that's out here putting those bad people away, like keeping them from doing harm. What does that say about the region? What does that say about the people that lord over the region or control it or protect it? Were they on the take for that or not? Or did they just not know about it because the kingdom used to be wealthy and have enough soldiers, but now it doesn't? 100 years have gone by and a lot of things have crept up, but there's still a royal family collecting taxes. And everything like that. It creates so many things in the moment that you can then just in the moment decide ties into the plot or not. And that's why world building is not about writing a novel. You're not writing an outline for a 5-book series part. When you're creating your TTRPG campaign, you're introducing conflicts, and some of those conflicts might tie into the greater challenge of the overall point of the campaign, which is, as I've said, capitalism is bad and kill gods. Because that's a
kill God, destroy capitalism.
Kill God, destroy capitalism.
The classic thing
open
that
a bakery.
Our real world desperately needs.
Open a bakery. It's the whole campaign. There's systems for that. That's the other thing. Also, think about the system that you're using and what it's good at and what it's not good at. What is the system good at? A system like Pathfinder, like D&D, like Starfinder, like Cyberpunk is good at big fucking stories, because it's built with the runway to be able to tell them. A system that's about opening a coffee shop and like running an inn, probably not the system you should build a big story on.
Luckily, I think D&D is the D20 adventure style games are pretty scalable.
Yeah, you can scale down. You can absolutely scale down. It just has the ability to go all the way up.
But you're right, like other systems are not going to be as good
Masks.
At scaling.
Masks is a classic system. The system runs out of time and runs out of runway once your characters have worked through their personal growth evolution of becoming superheroes, moving from their adolescence or teenagehood or childhood into who they want to become as adult people. That's the point of that system, and that can take some time, but at the end of the day, you're not going to then go back and use masks to tell an ongoing multi-season story. You're going to use it to tell the story it is built to tell, which is why it's important to have so many to know at least and have access to looking into other systems. If you're like, as a GM, I don't want to run 100 sessions. I don't want to level characters for 5, 10, 15 levels. I want to play a finite story in a college town. All right, well, there's systems for that. I want to...
Even then, like, I want to interject on that one, because, like I said, D&D can do that, and that's, I think, part of the reason why D&D and Pathfinder and those D20 systems are so popular, is because there's scalability. But I often think that, and this is another thing that kind of tie into world building, you can build a game with a coherent world that's just a pocket.
Yeah,
just a small space.
You don't need to, just because you built a coherent world doesn't mean you need to poke at all the edges of it.
Curse of Strahd is a perfect example of this, being a contained region that focuses on the politics and themes of that region only. It takes you from 1 to 10, and then the story can be over. And don't be afraid to let your campaigns end. That's another thing.
I'm watching High Rollers. I'm in episode 160. They go 3 hours per session. I think they're almost to 170 on their current campaign. That's 500 hours in one campaign, and it's dope, and I love it. But I'm like, they go almost weekly. Like, they try for weekly. It's been 3 years, more than 3 years, coming up on 4 years since they started that campaign. I'm like, maybe this story could have been shorter. I know that they're all enjoying themselves, so it doesn't matter. But this is a great example of, like, this could have been a shorter arc. And everything, and they're already preparing for their campaign 3. They're in the final days, but like Arc Through the Mill is the longest thing I will have ever run, with the most sessions and the longest arc. And though I love it, I'm not gonna do another one of those immediately thereafter. That's not the plan. I'm going to, when I run my next thing, I'm like, is there something I can run in like 15 to 20? So can I get from a point A? Because that's the more important thing about the world building. That's the more important thing about, because world building is so tied into campaign planning, right? And if you build a small world, you can tell a smaller story, right? If you build a town, and that's the world that you've built, it's easier to do smaller stories in a town. If you build a globe, it's tempting to constantly go out into that globe, right? And explore different regions. Your players are going to be tempted by it. You're going to be tempted by it. Everyone's tempted by it. So if you only have, if your players run to the edge of town and there's an invisible wall and they're just running up against it in place, right? Guess what? They're going to stay in the town.
Put them on an island.
Put them on an island. Put them
on an island.
Put them underground. Put them in the sky. Put them inside of a big giant tree, right? Do something, right? Put them in a submarine, right?
Big sky laser, right?
Yep.
Big sky beam is also like a little trope, and that's because of these comic book movies. Every single story has to be some big world-ending threat, and that gets old.
Yeah, it gets tiring. It's part of, for better or worse, it's part of why the majority of the content for Phase 4 in Marvel, that especially on Disney Plus, was like, what if it's, I mean, talk about localizing it to a town. WandaVision is entirely about that shit. And everything.
And then unfortunately they kind of botched that with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness.
Well, so I think with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, they tricked it, right? Because they're like, all right, so something bad is happening to this world, right? Because of Spider-Man, and we know we're going to go into the multiverse and everything. Something bad is happening on a world scale. But a lot of Multiverse of Madness happens in, like, end dimension or side dimension or a variation. And, like, they could have leaned even more into that and been like, nothing really happens in the New York that you know. And so it makes sense that none of the things that happened would matter to anyone but the characters it happened to. And then all of the, it was business as usual for New York Prime and the MCU, right? And everything. And so, but like, yeah, the ability to tell a story that only affects the local neighborhood or the town or maybe even the barony that you're in, right? Like the region. And again, that's Curse of Strahd all over. It's essentially a barony. That's
Yeah,
all
it's
that
a
it
county.
is.
You're in a county.
You're in a county. There's a few towns. There's things, and it's literally built as, and this is an isolated area that
You cannot
reach.
leave.
You can't leave, and you can't reach the world. That's in the narrative. And so, why not give yourself that gift and put those? And you can play. Curse of Strahd is not huge, but it's long. You can play it for quite some time.
You can easily get a year or two out of it.
So it's like, it's a great middle of, it's like, all right, you're not looking for like seasons of television, but you also would like maybe like 2 to 3 films in a place kind of thing, or like a mini series where it takes some time. So games don't have to be 5 sessions or 3 sessions or 12 sessions or 150 sessions. They can be as many as they take, but like, there's an argument to be made that it's built in D&D, it's built very much with like levels in mind and getting to those challenges, but with like a little bit of like rearrangement and stuff like that, you could spend, if you wanted Curse of Strahd to continue to expand, you could spend fucking years playing in that realm if you want. There's lots to do there.
There's a lot of material out there too.
Yeah, and there's lots of bonus material and stuff like that. And so you might start your campaign and be like, all right, my campaign is in fucking Wood City, and we're all inside of a tree, and we're all fucking like 6 inches tall and everything like that. And that's the whole thing. And then you really liked it. You played it for 25, 30 sessions, right? It was a pretty big, meaty thing. You got to the end of it. You felt good about it. If you're in one of the more scalable systems, then you're like, all right. And then at the end of this, the players get whisked away into like a little scenario where they're suddenly in a large mansion on some farm somewhere, and it's a completely different thing, and they have to deal with giant-sized humans and stuff like that. And that's a whole other story, right? And you can kind of continue it. So you can always decide to further expand. What's hard to do is when you've built all of that fucking huge world, you've built your pantheon of gods, you have a different calendar of months, a different calendar of days, all of the holidays, all of the political lore, you've given them maps of the world and each continent with the countries and everything like that. It's so hard to then be like, nah, we just played in this area.
And not just that, but you also create, when you lore dump that kind of material in front of your players, you create decision paralysis.
Yeah.
You create, and then you also create FOMO for your players too, where they're like, well, damn it, there's all this other stuff I could have done, and I went this way. And what if the other stuff was more fun? We're not talking.
Absolutely.
Obviously, we're not. Obviously, there's a fine line there, being of like creating so little that you effectively railroad your players is another risk. But I think that risk is much less. I think I see that happening way less than I see the opposite.
There's
happening.
Other problems that come with that risk that are problems in the gameplay that are less, like, it's very rare that the problem is going to be that you had too little and that you really railroaded your players. And then the problem is that it's like, oh, well, you just needed to world build more. Most of the DMs that like aggressively railroad their players are there's other things that they're doing that are making the gameplay unsatisfying by denying players constantly. They're caging them. They're not even. Yeah. It's not even a railroad. They're in a railroad. Their masks are on. Their seatbelts are buckled, and someone will tase them if they get up out of their seat. That's usually the big problem on heavily when people talk about being forced so much. It's because they keep getting tased every time they go in a direction the DM doesn't want them to go into in the simplest decisions. Not the thing. But if railroading is not, hey, so for the next session I planned here, so I've just got to keep figuring out a way to move my party in that direction because I need them to go there because I don't have anything for them anywhere else yet. Or you can get real loose with it and be like, your players are welcome to go anywhere on the map. But if they go somewhere you don't have something to play with, you just warn them in the heads up. Hey, if you go somewhere and I'm not prepared and I'm not in a headspace to improv at all, I'm just gonna let you know that that's where we have to end the session for that session, and I need some time. I need a week or 2 weeks, whatever your play schedule is, to think about it. We've all done it before. We've all had to do it, and that's fine.
I have players who wanted to go running off to the next town right after they got to the first town.
That's the big thing too. So we're not against big world building. We're not against world prep. And certainly if you love doing it, fucking just do it for yourself. Just enjoy doing it. But here's the deal. When you're building your big world prep, don't get lost in only thinking macro. Remember that every piece of your world is populated by various things. Any town that is more than like 12 people, right? Any like true town of like hundreds or thousands, or if it's a city, of thousands and thousands of residents, right, is going to have tons of stories and tons of little things going on. And you don't need to know all of those things, but the goal, that verisimilitude, that goal to make something feel lived in and earnest and like it got here in a logical way, just kind of have single lines about stuff that like help you kind of know that stuff that you're not going to really investigate is happening there. Just like you said at the beginning, if it's a city, what is that city known for? Is it the capital? You know, is it the seat of power? Is it a city that is balks against the local power systems and it has enough money and juice to do that? Is it the place of the University of Learned Magic, right? Is that what's driving the city?
Me think of something else though that's I think is in many ways, now what I'm thinking about, is more important to verisimilitude than having all of these detailed lore pieces.
Yeah.
And that's describing your environments in depth.
Mm-hmm.
Is being able to give your players a lush, descriptive experience. I think is really important if you actually want to create the idea of spaces feeling more real.
So I think go on.
I think when you and obviously you can go too far into that, and I think you don't want to sit there and write a novel, but giving your players the senses of what they're experiencing, the smells, the sounds, the sensations of the spaces they're in.
Mm-hmm.
Telling players that they've entered a city that is hot and muggy and crowded and noisy with the chatter of the thousands of people around you, and the streets are muddy so that your boots stick to the ground as you walk, and it's dark and rainy. That is going to give as much, or if not more, feeling of realness to your players than the connections of the political people in that city.
I'm gonna talk about two of my favorite GMs, Griffin McElroy and Brian Murphy. Griffin McElroy, The Adventure Zone, had a great statement that they said on a podcast where they are not big on going into those florid descriptions, and they are not big on that. But it is important to make your place feel lived in, to do as much as you can with as few words as possible if you're that kind of DM.
Yes.
And so their example of this, and it is the fucking perfect example, is you walk up to a biker bar, and there's, in the parking lot, which is cracked from age or from years of age and neglect, you step around that one puddle. That puddle that never seems to drain. And that is enough to give you're like, your biker bar, cracked pavement, puddle that never drains. I'm in a divey place. I know the vibe of this place. Yeah. That is brilliant. The other advice from a person like from Murph in NADPOD, which is all theater of the mind, much like Taz, because it's a podcast, right, is that when the players enter the new location that they're going to go to, that is an important space for them to enter when they get to their new region, if you will, to when you first introduce it to him. His mentality is, I want it to be like when I get to a new level or space in a video game. And like the design is unique and cool from the last place, and what's cool about it. So he'll go for like a couple paragraphs of narration of really showing really mostly what the players see and kind of what the scale of what they're seeing is. A great example is that the first episode of NADPOD, after they get past Dragon Pussy, the first episode of NADPOD talks about the first village that they go to, which is kind of by a lake. And they're like, it's a small village with a small few wooden docks. The lake is glowing with an unnatural light as you enter this valley between two hills. And he doesn't go on for long. It's maybe like 6 to 12 or to 10 sentences. But it really gives you an idea of how the village is seated, the fact that there's a glowing lake. That's interesting, and it affects the light of the village and everything like that. Village. It describes the scale and size of what they're looking at, and then the players are using all of their history of absorbing fiction to fill in every bit of the gaps and put in what they think that they're seeing right then, and that's how you can take it. You want to describe and excite your players for the sort of vibe of the place, and you can do it in 2 sentences. Or you can do it in 12 sentences. But either way, the goal is the same. I want to go to there. I want to be there and be in this space. And if you... And it's not only, it's the only thing, I don't subscribe to this I don't practice this myself, but I will preach it. If I barely write down any pre-scripted stuff for me to say. But man is doing that the best. If you know your players are going to get to a new location the next session, give yourself the time to just write up the description. Look at it, fiddle with it, make sure you're hitting the sentences, keep it to like a couple paragraphs, and just read it to them.
My counter to that, and a design approach that I've seen that I really liked, was rather than writing a pre-structured paragraph, you have a few key details, and then a list of descriptive words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that when you have something like that, it's going to come out more naturally at the table when you're speaking, rather than if you sit there and read.
Yeah.
If you have a script that you go by, and there's nothing wrong with going by scripts, but sometimes reading a script can feel a bit rigid.
That's what you want to keep that script short. You also don't want to read it for the first time out loud to your players. If you want to loosen yourself up, write it, keep it short, right? Depending on your kind of verbosity as a person, and read it to yourself a couple times and everything. Let it help you set the tone if you write something, or if you hit bullet points, like if you're like you were sort of describing earlier. It's humid. People are packed. Why is it raining and humid at the same time? Why is the city so hot if I'm being rained on? The crowd...
you're like in a tropical region then.
Yeah, the ground is muddy, but the city is organized, right? These aren't even really interconnected, well-florid statements. They're just statements about what they're having. And you can take and I'm going to be honest, take the 30 seconds, minute to set that, and then exactly returning to those descriptive lines. Humid, wet, dark, crowded, oppressive. You give yourself some adjectives to do it, and then you don't have to keep constantly redefining what you read or always bringing that up. But especially if you're in a space for several sessions, bring it up at the beginning of the session each time. Remind them in the recap, remind them in the moment they transition everything. They wake up the next morning, there's sweat on their body, it's still humid, and you can still hear the rain outside, right? You're just reinforcing that tone. You can, in modern D&D, and especially online, use maps, use minis, stuff like that to help you with this too. You can absolutely, if you're not comfortable with that level of narration, think in your mind, what am I basing this city on? Oh, I'm basing this city on Cairo, let's say. Cairo from now, right? So a city built up with pyramids in the background. Ancient history right outside your window, right? You can literally say, like Cairo, you like you see in Moon Knight, or like you see
right.
in that your players, if they've seen the same things as you, if they have the same media touchstones, or it'll be like, yes, this is a giant tower with a circle of death around it, like in Lord of the Rings with the tower there. That's fine, because not everybody has to be Matt Mercer. Not everybody has to be a professional DM. It's okay if you're like, I'm trying to think of Cyberpunk, I can't think of it. The city is not dark and gritty like Blade Runner. It's more capitalist dystopia, like Minority Report. And then if they've seen Minority Report, they're like, I'm with you. It's fucking, there's holographic ads. Everything's got a light bloom effect and is in a blue tint for some reason. Like they know what you're talking about. So you can kind of play with that and use those cultural references. If you're maybe not so much the words person, you're more the puzzles and challenge and like interesting fun NPC guy, or the girl that like is good at fairy tale lore, but not so much how politics works. It would be like you walk into the king, like the keep, and it's an immediate fucking Game of Thrones vibe. Everybody looks like they're lying to each other all the time. That's fine. That's a perfect, because the players will still probably have fun with you. They'll still be like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Let's get into the parts that you're good at. And so we talk a lot about these world building things from experienced DMs that are both very interested in writing, scripting, English language, all of those things, right? That's what we do. But you don't have to do all of that. And again, the less big macro world building you're filling every detail in, the less stress you're putting on to do all of that stuff. If you're not comfortable with all of it, if maybe you didn't grow up religious, so you don't know anything about religion, and so you're like, I don't know, it's like gods, maybe don't include a lot of religion if you don't know anything about it, but or let your player fill it in that knows a lot about it because they were raised Catholic, and so they were like, yeah, I know a lot about this, and it's like, okay, invent the religion for me. When people ask, is there anything I know about this, roll for it, and if they roll high enough, then it's like, all right, tell me what it is. So tell me what the church did here 500 years ago.
Yeah.
You know more about that kind of stuff than me, and then you get to kind of play with that.
Yeah, world building is a very complex thing.
It's complicated. Go on.
And I just think, I think we've just kind of gone over the biggest pitfalls.
Yeah.
Of trying to world build.
You don't need every generation of history that's come before you. You don't even honestly need much before your players' lifetimes.
You don't even need to. You don't need, like, you can have a town.
There's like, I had a lot of stuff there, but they go to a town called Davidstown. They go to a town called Davidstown, and it's called Davidstown because David founded the town, and he put in the town charter that David must lead the town. And then when he passed away, his son David was in charge of the town. And then when he passed away, their daughter David was in charge of the town. And then when they passed away, they didn't have any children. And so then someone named David had to be in charge of the town. And then over time, the town started naming all their kids David because it needed to be a David that ran the town. So like 50% of the people were named David. This did two things for me. Number one, they didn't ask anything more about the history of the town because that is a ridiculous history. It's a fishing village. It's a fishing village, and so they didn't ask anything more about that. Number two, it meant half my NPCs could be named David, and that was a relief. because I'd be like, "Oh, you're talking about
Your
Tall
town
David?"
is a trolling device.
I mean, it was for comedy. That was the point of it. But like, that's the thing, right? Like, you could go to a town, and in that town, people don't have last names. Why? Because you're bad at coming up with last names. You can come up with first names as the day is long, but remembering last names and families and titles, just not your thing. And so guess what? That town doesn't have last names. In fact, that whole region doesn't have last names. Last names aren't a thing yet in that area. Great. Your player characters have last names? Super cool. How did they get them and this town doesn't have them? And you can kind of warm up into that, right? That, like, there's so many things that you can do to excuse the fact that world building can be extremely stressful. Session prep can be extremely stressful. Remembering tons of details can be extremely stressful. Worrying that you can't just go back and make something important that you threw away can be super stressful. And the less you lock yourself in, the less stress you have. And the more flexibility, the more excitement, the more contribution you give yourself. And at the end of the day, that will make the play more fun for you, and it should be fun for you because you're running the game. You're just at the table like everyone else.
DM is a player too.
DM is a player. They're playing all the rest of the cast. Bad guys, good guys, jokes, pitfalls, puzzles, conflicts. They're playing a lot of that role. So make it easy on yourself. Also, name generators, tables, as you said, absolutely clutch. Do not be afraid. And whether or not you're streaming, whether or not you ever would plan to stream, record your sessions. In some even if it's just on your phone and you're just listening to the audio or you've got a mic up in the room, do yourself a favor, record your sessions. Because then if you're bad at taking notes or you forget something, you can just go back and listen to it. Just go back and watch it. Just go back and hear it again and be like, oh yeah, I did say that.
Another solution to that is, one of my things I do is I designate roles to the people at the table, including someone whose responsibility is to take notes.
Take notes. Yep.
And they get inspiration for taking notes.
Yeah, rewards for notes. You always want a note taker. Rewards for notes. Rewards for snacks. Have a note taker. Have that note taker send you the notes at the end of the thing. You're busy. You're trying to run the game in real time. Someone else can take notes because you don't know when the players are going to mess around. And mess around and do something that you did not expect, and you have no notes related to your prep materials that were that, and you remember it was really funny, but you forgot some of the details, and maybe you only meet once every couple weeks, or God forbid, once a month. How are you going to remember last month's session clearly? You're not.
Why don't you have an eidetic memery? Come on, get your shit together.
Yeah, you're not. And a lot of players think, well, world building will help with that, and it won't. It won't. Well, I mean, it'll hurt
it's
it.
It's going to make it worse.
Yeah, your players are going to do what they're going to do.
Make it worse.
You're not
going to remember what the fuck
You'll
happened.
be like, which NPC and what did he matter? And I get that we're taking a big bite out of World Anvil, which is entirely meant to remediate massive fucking world building.
I'm sure they'll be fine.
After
our comments here.
Yeah, I'm sure. Whether you use Evernote, whether you use a web page, whether you use a wiki for your players. Again, if this is what you love, there's one person on D&D TikTok that the way that they do session recaps is days before their next session, they create a thumbnail and they do an episode synopsis like a Netflix series. And so it's not actually, they don't record. They're not doing that. It's just if you go to their webpage and you're playing in their campaign, you can go to your television series, go to the season that you're on, go to the episode and see the synopsis they wrote up for what happened on the last episode. That's super dope. I would never expect that from everyone. That's something that player is having fun with. If you want to create a bunch of maps and a bunch of lore and then give the links to your players and limit what players can see what and everything like World Anvil does, fucking go to town on it. If you want to do what Matt Mercer does and do all of your campaigns in the same massive world that you keep building out and filling in more and more, and it's different continents and different regions, and then over time, the things that happened in previous campaigns with different characters affect the things that are happening in current campaigns, Go to town with that. But you don't need to do that. What you should be like is be like Anthony Birch on Dungeons and Daddies, where you loosely have a plan that your players will absolutely screw you up on every time, and you have to constantly just go back and be like, well, I'm glad I didn't have too much for the next session, because now I need to plan it out, because they went left and my options were up and down and they decided left was the option.
Yep.
So good. Do be listening to Dungeons and Daddies. It's very satisfying. It's a very good example of how to the rules a game can be, and over the 69 episodes of the first campaign, of course it's 69, over the 69 episodes of the first campaign, they tell an excellent story very loosely, and their episodes are only like an hour and 10 minutes long. They get so much done in 70 hours that takes other longer, well-planned, massively world infused things. And in their case, their patrons provide all their NPC names. He doesn't even make them up. He just picks it from the patrons because they have that option, which is the same as having a name generator. It's just like, all right, and this character's name is Boreanis. They have a Boreanis in the campaign because Boreanis is a hilarious name. And will always be a cultural touchstone. But yeah, I think that's it. I think that's all we can talk about with world building without getting
I think that
super. Unless we're talking about like maps.
I'm going to share this thing that I just recently came in.
Let me expand you out so that you can share it a little bit louder or a little bit larger. What is that? This is the one. Okay, give me a moment.
This is a Kickstarter that we backed a little while back, and it just came in, and it's quite robust. I've not seen one quite so a tome like this before. And when they say tome, they mean it's hefty. It's a textbook. And this is one of the few times I'm glad that there are not illustrations really in this book. There are a few here and there, but they're very, very few and far between. What this book is it's a book of just constant randomized tables. With rolling charts for everything. If you want to roll a monster, there's a whole section in here about how to just roll up a monster, and it has multiple pages. And so if you're trying, now I would recommend doing this for every monster, but if you're like, I want a particularly unique beast, you're going to sit down here and you're going to roll through your beast.
Why not?
Roll through construct. You're going to roll through you have all sorts of different stuff here. They even use like the sides, these little things to put information into. So there's just like little details all over the side, all over the place.
It's a compendium. It's a guide.
It's just really fucking dense. It's very dense. Very cool. If you're a person who likes random tables like me,
yeah.
I definitely recommend checking it out.
And where can they get that again?
Well, I don't know exactly. I backed it on Kickstarter. I imagine you could probably look up the company. It's called Mythmere Games.
Mythmere Games. They certainly have a website. They certainly at least have a way to get a PDF of this.
Yeah, they would definitely have a way to get a PDF of it. It's probably on DriveThruRPG, where like most Kickstarter projects have a book in PDF format. Exactly.
So, and I think my RPG recommendation is I think that you should watch, if you want a good way to kind of scale down a world and tell the story over time and make it feel like a world, but not spend the time filling in every little detail of the world and focusing on the important parts and the conflicts therein, and again, characters out. Watch She-Ra and the Princesses of Power on Netflix. It's a completed series. It's 5 seasons. I think it's like 50 some odd episodes.
Pretty robust.
And everything. But that's about a planet being taken over by an evil industrial organization, and about the development of She-Ra and the various princesses of power challenging that organization. And there's several kingdoms, there's several continents, and it is not hard to comprehend what's going on. Each kingdom you only really see for a little bit, and you see like a major location. They don't do like a tour. Sometimes they ignore areas, and then like they'll mention them, and then it'll be like several episodes later or a couple seasons. That is a great example of how to tell a character outward story and reveal things over time without ever getting too lost in the sauce of details and letting the audience just be like, yeah, I know what an evil empire looks like. It's got lots of soldiers and bad things in it. I don't need to see every corner of it. I just need to see a location or two. And it gives me the vibe. I know what like a flower kingdom probably looks like. It's covered in beautiful flowers and flora. Like that's its point. Just show me like the castle and like a wooded glen, and I can interpret the rest. But nonetheless, I think that's good. I think that's it. I think we'll probably come back. I don't know. You want to come back in a couple weeks? Come back on the 5th of December?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be right after you and I meet on. Didn't we talk about meeting on the 3rd?
I think
December?
So. Yeah, somewhere in there.
You and I are meeting on the 3rd of December to work on some other stuff, and then that'll be perfect to follow up because then we can do. Our 5th, we can do the Library Day discussion.
Library Day discussion. So we'll be talking about a bunch of non D&D, probably non-Pathfinder TTRPGs. A bunch of indie TTRPGs, things that you can get on Drive-Thru
there
RPG.
Could be some third-party D&D. I think we should just say
non-first
party.
Non-wizards, and what's their name?
Paizo.
And Paizo materials, and everything. A lot of OSR. A lot of Powered by the Apocalypse, a lot of that. And so get excited for that. We'll be back next Monday, and then we'll be back here. Brandon and I will be back here next Sunday, I should say, for Through the Mill, the next episode of Through the Mill.
Yes, Through the Mill.
And
then we only have a few more weeks because we're almost in December. Only a few more weeks till people start coming back. Until
the rest of the party comes back. But nonetheless, I have to go to the bathroom, which is a very personal and intimate detail. It will take me an hour and a half to 5 hours. So I'm kidding. But I will be leaving.
My bathroom time too.
And so, and plus, how am I going to check TikTok? Anyway, for Brandon and myself, this has been Questboard Gaming. Come back here. We'll see you again on the 5th.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.